All right, so this is my conversation with Sarah Adams. Sarah is a former intelligence analyst and targeter with the Central Intelligence Agency. She also served as the senior advisor to the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on Benghazi. In addition to that, she is the co author of the book Benghazi Know Thy Enemy, a cold case investigation into the events that unfolded in Benghazi in 2012, where Ambassador Stevens, amongst a few other Americans, died as a result of the terrorist attacks by Al Qaeda. In the book, Sarah explores the attacks and showcases the terrorists who were involved. I hope you would enjoy my conversation with Sarah, and be sure to get her book when you get a chance. Sarah, it's always wonderful to have you on the show. I would love. Welcome to the East Wing. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thanks. Good to see you again.
Yeah, great seeing you too. So, as I mentioned earlier, before we started recording, I think I had different idea of what I could explore with you today. But obviously, we just heard news not too long ago of the assassination of Sinwar, the leader of Hamas and a principal architect of the October 7th attacks on Israel, and that's a major piece of news that would I think it would be worth sort of exploring further in terms of the significance of the assassination and I guess a little bit about I guess the assassination campaign that's now being carried out by Israel, a very, very sophisticated campaign, I might add. So one thing I do want to say here is that you, the book you published with with Boone, Benghazi, Know Thy Enemy. I think the title, when I first heard of the assassination of Sinwar, I immediately sort of tried to further explore his background, the life that he had, and obviously the significance of his assassination. And with the title of your book, Know Thy Enemy, I think for Sinwar, he did know, quote, his enemy for many years, right? He learned, he was in Israeli prisons. He mastered Hebrew. He knew he had a tremendous amount of exposure to Israeli culture, Israeli language, obviously Hebrew, and a lot of other elements. So I think that worked out for him, I guess, pretty well in terms of becoming a leader of obviously Hamas and with the sophisticated operations that he carried out throughout the years. So tell me about that. Tell me more about that. Was that? How often do we see that, say, from leaders like, or leaders like Sinwar, who put such a great effort into really learning about the people that they deem to be their enemies. This is something I think it's something worth exploring.
Yeah, well, you don't see a lot of times the senior leaders take it to that level, right? I've seen a lot more like external operatives, right? Like they want to go into the West and do an operation for, let's say it's Al Qaeda or something, and they put the time in, right? They maybe studied over there. Like they invest in understanding the culture because, like you said, the best way to actually attack or find the weaknesses, right, is to actually understand the environment, understand how you fit in the environment, how you might not fit in the environment, and then you can operate better. And so I think that is, like you said, what made him successful and what made Hamas maybe feel that they were more powerful than they were, or maybe they even underestimated the Israelis, right? Because, at the end of the day, we've seen, as you said, a lot of very targeted operations. Well, those weren't put together even in the last year, right? That could be 5, 10 years of background targeting material, tracking locations, right? And then now they kind of like, pull the trigger on those. So that's something too we got to keep in mind, right? The enemy's watching us, and we're watching the enemy, and it's almost this cat and mouse game.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting that when I was reading earlier about the operation, it wasn't it wasn't even planned. I mean, it wasn't even a special operations force that carried out the assassination. That was quite interesting because I would have thought that obviously at first blush, I would have thought that okay, this might have been planned from the get go, from the minute that news broke out about the October 7th attacks. I would have thought that okay, the plan from the get go is to try to get Sinwar, perhaps capture him. Um, but maybe that was a plan, but I'm sure that most of us would have thought that it would have been perhaps carried out by a special operations force, not necessarily like I don't know, a regular maybe military unit.
Well, when you something's short breaking and you don't have much time, you take who you can get, right? Unfortunately, you can't always bring in the Navy SEALs, right? So if you know you have the short window to do something, and that resource takes 12 hours to spin up or to relocate or to get their supplies, right? You don't want to take that risk. In this case, at least, they didn't want to, right? And so they took, the action arm probably that was fastest, quickest, and most effective to do it. That's my opinion on it, but we'd have to wait to see kind of, as we've learned with all these Israeli operations, we get every detail after the fact. Like I can't believe even the details we've gotten on the pager operation. So I'm just
Right.
sitting back and waiting to hear those details because they're fascinating too.
Exactly. No, exactly. I do want to say that here maybe this is something you have um, so much to say about, given your experience, obviously with the CIA, with the agency. We see now a great deal of a lot of the top dogs being, taken out. You got the leader, obviously, of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, Haniya back in July, um, Hezbollah's leader, obviously.
Yeah.
Um, and this is, we see this being carried out, but I think it would also be interesting to know maybe what perhaps understanding more about the strategic significance and the blow that that might create on these groups, whether it be Hezbollah, Hamas, or otherwise. Especially since I mean you might speak from U.S. experience with Al Qaeda and with taking out Osama bin Laden, right? That is a major blow, but I think it would be interesting to hear what the sort of significance here, strategically, and obviously on the war, the operations that are being carried out, broadly speaking.
Yeah, well, you use the right word, right? Operations. So, like the US's success really wasn't taking out bin Laden, right? That was just kind of like the win they always wanted. Their success was over and over again taking out the head of Al Qaeda's external operations, right? Because he would plan the attacks in the West, or they would, whoever that person was, and you take him out, you stop a plot. You take out the next one, you stop a plot, right? So these key individuals now that we've seen, especially since January, kind of, taken off the battlefield, these were key operational planners, right? Or they were key individuals who ran the missile program, right? Or the training programs. And so those are like, I like to call them the doers, right? They're the guys that like go get it done, right? And remember, a lot of them have 20, 30 years of experience. I mean, obviously some longer, when we talk about even the individuals involved way back in the Beirut bombings, right? So you're losing thousands of years of experience in Hamas and Hezbollah now. Like that is extremely difficult to reinvent, right? And they likely won't. They'll likely just align more with Al Qaeda, as we mentioned, that the Taliban, IRGC, and take in those skills, right, instead of bringing up really junior people to lead these things. So they luckily have the relationships to fill in some of these gaps, but it is going to be very difficult to be operationally effective.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that's interesting about recently published, I guess a sort of a sketch of the ones who collaborated with Hamas from Al Qaeda to carry out the October 7th attacks on Israel. Um, Here, I'm interested to know more about that sort of connection that has been established, maybe over the years, maybe recently, and so when do you think that level of that relationship started being fostered and cultivated between Hamas and Al Qaeda to the extent that we have now a collaboration on a deadly attack on October 7th. I mean that is very significant. I'd love to maybe hear more about that, and you can tell us more about these names that you've published of Al Qaeda operatives who collaborated with Hamas.
Well, the really interesting thing is, and I know you'll understand this, but the relationship that matters the most is like the Libyan Palestinian relationship, right?
Mm.
Because that's what Izzadine, he fought way back when the Italians came into Libya, and that's where this militant, fighting mujahideen type of relationship formed. But if you want to talk present day, really, a lot of it happened around the Libyan revolution. Like Hamas members came in and supported that. And then, as you know, like Syria kicked off. And so Al Qaeda was fighting in Syria along with Hamas. And then, as you know, there was the second Libyan civil war, mostly in Benghazi and Darna starting in 2014. Hamas came in and fought with both Al Qaeda and ISIS during that war, right? So a lot of people are like, oh, they just came together. It's like, no, it's been at least a dozen years. They've been having these fighting relationships, right? And as you know, these are major wars. The Libyan Revolution was, I mean, the Syrian Civil War is still ongoing, and they're so emotionally invested in that, right? As people should be. Like, over 600,000 Syrians have unfortunately died in that, right? Like innocents. So it does bring a lot of these people together, and it hasn't just aligned Al Qaeda and Hamas, it's even brought ISIS closer to some of these groups, which is dangerous, right? The terrorists are coming together for joint causes.
Yeah, yeah. There's also the element of, I think, the obviously smuggling of weapons through Egypt, and I may have,
Mm-hmm.
I think I briefly maybe talked about that with you recently in recent months. That I think would have started after 2012, right?
Yeah, it actually started during 2012. Um, Main person at the time was Khalid Sharif, right? He was setting up what they were calling the Libyan National Guard. But what he really was doing at the time, he was using that military unit as a cover, and he was buying like weapons like he was a nation state, right? So not like black market weapons, but I'm the government of Libya. I'm buying these weapons. And he was buying those weapons, sending them to Hamas, like you said, through these pipelines through Egypt and whatnot. And then Al Qaeda was also very involved, as you know from our Benghazi book, like Wissam bin Hamid was a key supporter of Hamas. And actually, when he died, Abu Ubaidah, the spokesperson for Hamas, said, Wissam was the number one weapons supplier to the Al Qasim brigades, right? And then, we talk about the famous drone program of Hamas, right? Everybody saw the air program as they came into Israel. Well, that was named after a Libyan Tunisian, right? He was also close to Al Qaeda in Libya and like our Benghazi attackers, right? So these relationships have gone on for years. Even in the United States, we have Ahmed Abu Khatala in prison from Benghazi, the kind of the person they claim is the mastermind. But he also was bringing weapons into Gaza for Hamas. And I even put in our book a picture of him in Gaza. So yeah, these relationships go on a very long time, but like you said, they took advantage the most of this kind of security vacuum after Gaddafi fell, and that's really where the weapons got to like a high level of proliferation.
Hmm. This is this honestly this fascinates me because you see now there's there's no sort of U.S. ambassador to Libya. There hasn't been a well, there was a nomination, but I think I think if I'm not mistaken, the person who was being nominated decided to, I guess, step down. Um, and you see perhaps the influence of both uh, China and Russia, where they're trying to um, create some level of presence in Libya, but there are, but compared to U.S. influence or U.S. presence, it might not be as strong as that of, say, China's or Russia's. And there's, you have obviously here the issue of the proliferation. You have the ties, these connections between Hamas and Al Qaeda. What do you what is the U.S. If they're playing any role in trying to mitigate that? What are they? What is the plan? Is there a strategy? Is there something that is being done about this?
Honestly, in my opinion, if we're focused on Libya, I really think the US strategy has been like an anti-Russia strategy. I don't really think they're focused on counterterrorism like they were back during like Gaddafi's era. I think that's gone by the wayside, unfortunately. So I think that they're lacking in understanding this. I even remember seeing kind of one of the UN Security Council reports a few months back, and they made this comment about how there was a small group of like just 50 Al Qaeda guys in Libya. And I was like, what are you talking about? I can find 50 in 3 blocks in Tajura, right? So, yeah, there is a lack of really understanding collection. And a lot of it has to do with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? And this increase in collection of, hey, we're going to focus on Russia and what Russia's doing. Russia's the enemy now. And that's really been the focus in Libya, unfortunately. They really have, I think, huge blind spots on what the terrorists are doing, especially, like you said, not just the collaboration, but actually Libya has become one of the major financial hubs of Al Qaeda. And I just think that's just been completely ignored and lost in the shuffle of all this.
Yeah, and you have this is something that I also may be interested in exploring with you here is the account of the death of the son of bin Laden. I forgot what his first name was.
Hamza.
Hamza bin Laden. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hamza. Um, and that, you have reports in 2019 saying that, he was assassinated in operation, but it seems to be he's still around. And that is, what is happening here? What's the disconnect? What are we seeing here? Why is there a sort of why are there conflicting reports?
Yeah, I mean, the conflicting reports are because obviously the US government took the strike. And so when you do a strike, there's something called battle damage assessment, right? So
Mm.
you pull in all your info and then you make your assessment. Yes, he was killed. Well, the US government feels very strongly in their battle damage assessment of that strike to where they won't change their assessment, even though the Brits are even saying he's alive. Obviously, there's hundreds of Afghans now who have seen Hamza in the last few years. So unfortunately, sometimes it's hard to get people to admit they're wrong. And Hamza's obviously taking advantage of it, right? He's not going out and doing speeches. He is doing meetings, but they're small meetings with very trusted individuals, as you can imagine. He doesn't even meet a lot of like foreign type of delegations unless it's like Saudis or something. So he is also smart to play the game. And so he's leading Al Qaeda. But as you can imagine, if some people don't believe that, they're not collecting on him. And so he's getting to kind of like operate in the shadow, right? And not even feel that stress of, hey, someone's coming after me. I mean, even if you look at the US most wanted list, they haven't updated it. So his bounty is $1 million, right?
Oh,
That's nothing. Yeah, Bin Laden's bodyguard was 5 million, right? So yeah, so Hamza's not worried at all right now.
yeah, yeah, and you have today also a very perhaps willful, I would probably characterize it as willful avoidance of what is going on in Afghanistan, especially after with the pullout and the withdrawal. And I don't know if that is an accurate description or characterization, but I would say, yeah, we're just avoiding whatever's happening there is happening over there, and there's an sort of an we're overlooking the big picture. We're not seeing the long term effects of not perhaps taking a particular position or being robust in the approach of trying to tackle the situation over there. And this is, I think, something you might have a lot to say about, especially since we were just talking about Hamza bin Laden, and he might very well be in Afghanistan, right? If I'm not mistaken. So
Yes.
what can you maybe you can describe to us the situation over there and how much of a how much of what is happening over there that's being overlooked.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing happened after Benghazi, right? When we pulled out of Benghazi, people really wanted to be done with it. We did stay in Libya 2 more years, but there was like nobody discussed Benghazi, nobody worked Benghazi. The press didn't want to touch it. It was crazy for a bit. And then after the election, they're like, I'm done. And now Afghanistan's the same way. The administration's obviously pushing back to say, hey, it was successful. We took out all these people. But as we know, it's now become the greatest, terrorist safe haven probably of all time, right? It's way worse than it was in 2001, and it's now way worse than Iraq was at the, 2003, 2004 timeframe, which I don't think we ever thought we would see militancy at that level again. So it's actually very concerning. So yeah, and then as you know, the other thing is the media then won't pick it up, right? Because they reach out to the administration or to the different intelligence agencies, and they're like, that's not true or don't touch it. That's the Hamza bin Laden problem. So the Hamza bin Laden story sat on the news desks in the United States for over 2 years. That was basically the Brits pushing it out through their news outlets because US press wouldn't run it. So it actually also shows there's this kind of like, I don't know what you would call it, this push and pull between maybe British intelligence and the US government's intelligence over the Hamza bin Laden issue, which means there's a bigger problem between, right, the governments over the Al Qaeda issue, right, which is a problem. That's, at least if you're American, our closest ally, especially on the counterterrorism front, but for our whole existence really is Britain, right? So we have to keep that in mind too, because some of this not paying attention to Afghanistan or letting other people be harmed by what's coming out and emanating from Afghanistan is damaging some of these long-term relationships we have, besides all these counterterrorism assets and technology and investments we've made for 20 some years that we just like walked away from and said these platforms or these people don't matter to us anymore. And they do, right? There's going to be more attacks coming from Afghanistan. And then how do we circle back with these people and say, oh, we need you again, right? Like,
Mhm.
there's people I know now that hate the CIA when they served with us for very long periods of time. That's a very scary situation, right? Some are even in America and
Wow.
they're turning now against the US, right? I mean, we just saw it with the individual detained last week, right? He was a local guard at a CIA base in Afghanistan. About a year ago, he became like he just spent a lot of time with extremist content online and got like pulled into it and then reached out to ISIS, right? That stems from something, right? A break in trust.
Hmm. And would that be an unconventional case where it's 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 significant to the withdrawal of Afghanistan, or do we see some of that disappointment in other places where you had people serve with the agency, maybe in Iraq, maybe in Syria, and that level of disappointment manifests in the obviously into plotting or these plans to attack the U.S. And before we even talk, maybe you have something to say about that. There's also the access through, southern border issue, right? That's something that could be further explored. So I'd love to maybe hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I think the major abandonment in the past of like allies was really the Kurds, right? The Kurds never, though, turned on us. And I think it was a lot because so many like on the ground American troops stayed connected to them. A lot went over and volunteered with their own time and own money and fought with them. So it was almost like these personal relationships at least kept some of the tie going, but it was a huge abandonment of them, right?
Mm.
So I think the Afghans are feeling the same way. And the problem with the Afghans is slightly different. So we brought a large number of them to the United States, but their wives and children are still in Afghanistan. So you're in a tough situation, right? Because it's a country the women can't go out and do anything, right? Unless they have someone in their family there. Taliban are taking advantage of this, right? They're saying, I'm going to marry your 11-year-old daughter off to the Taliban if you don't come back to Afghanistan, right? So they're doing a lot of blackmail too, which is then now going to put these people in a compromising position. They got a lot of them to return. They're now torturing them. So this is this ongoing problem, right? And then now those people feel, hey, I might have a home in America, but America is still not protecting me, right? There's even Taliban and Haqqanis in the United States actively targeting these people, letting the Taliban in Afghanistan know where they are. They're reaching out to them. So it's this constant, like, you never feel safe or secure when they should feel that way here. So if they're losing trust too, like, hey, how are you bringing my enemy here? And you say you're going to protect me, like every ounce of trust is basically being broken again and again.
Wow. But that's an interesting point, though. How are they gaining? How is the Haqqani and the Taliban sort of gaining access here? What is how? Like it's is that that is very unusual, I would probably say.
It's unusual in normal circumstances, okay? But in the way we did the withdrawal from Kabul, really the main standard was you had to work for the government for a certain amount of time. And it was a very small amount of time, like a year in some cases. Now, we spent 22, 23 years in Afghanistan, right? There are times members of the Taliban and members of the Haqqanis worked with us and they are actually eligible to come. So unless someone
Wow.
intercedes in the process and says that person's a Haqqani, and even then people have tried and they've still gotten here, which is frustrating. So a lot of Taliban worked for us over the years, right? We weren't probably doing the counterintelligence good enough to do something about it, right? But they are eligible to come. And until somebody actually does a really good job and looks at the process and actually does an extreme vetting of the situation, they're going to keep getting here. And once they're here, it's very hard to get them out, right? That's
Mm,
the one problem, right? They're now America's problem in America for a long period of time.
gosh, and this is not something that I think it would that be considered unprecedented? Like I don't think there were. This is where I guess I reached the limits of my knowledge here, but I don't know of historical instances when you had such, maybe from a different country, terrorists being present because they present in the country because they figured out maybe a loophole, hole in the system. And here, I mean, you have this particular case of eligibility, and they're abusing that whole and obviously there's the issue of the southern border. There's access too, which might be overlooked as well. So here we have two primary issues where that can create a that can make terrorist activity rampant domestically. What's how can one be able to fix that? I mean, that's a big problem.
I mean, it's very complicated, right? There was even a situation where the Haqqanis were trying to marry Haqqanis into women in the US pipeline. And
Ooh.
it happened to one of my friends who was former CIA, an Afghan woman she was helping. Luckily, she's smart enough to know, whoa, family just married her to a Haqqani, right? And she was able to contact the US government and cancel the application. But think of all these other volunteers. I mean, they're great humanitarians trying to help these Afghans, but they're not going to know that the daughter of the family married a Haqqani, right?
Yeah.
It's just that there's nuances like that are very complicated, especially on terrorism stuff. As you know, even just in Libya, there's so many components, right? And the family level, the tribal level that you understand, but I wouldn't understand it, right? You'd be like, well, that family for 3 generations has been involved in terrorism, but I wouldn't know that from the name. So that's a huge problem we have too. And like you said, the terrorists are exploiting it. The other thing too is they are trying to make our government look foolish, right? They know that they can reach out and touch these people here. They know they can come across the border, and they're taking an advantage of it, right? Because it makes the US look weaker. And remember, to these terrorists in Afghanistan, they beat us, right? And
Mhm.
now they're trying to replicate that. Libya's a really good example, right? The head of Al Qaeda in Libya, Belhaj, and the head of Al Qaeda in East Libya both contacted the Haqqanis, like, how do we replicate this in Libya, right? We know they're trying to replicate it in Mali. That's kind of like fast forwarded. They're doing highly successful. They want to replicate it in Syria. They want to replicate it in Iraq, right? So Afghanistan now is the model. And to these terrorists, they think they defeated the US and they will keep coming after us. And like you said, taking advantage of these weaknesses because they know they can and they know they're going to get away with it.
That that is very for those that are not paying attention. I mean that could be very dangerous in the long run, especially when you have now most of the attention is being focused on Gaza and Israel, and now obviously Lebanon. We're on the brink of a regional war. For some
Mm-hmm.
analysts, we could already be in a regional war. And there's a huge deal of focus on trying to get a ceasefire, trying to get an end to the war. And obviously, you've got Ukraine and Russia and the whole situation over there. It's like there's so much that's happening, but there's obviously there's things that can slip through the cracks, like this situation that we're seeing right now. This abuse of the system by the Haqqani, the Taliban, um, and other issues unfolding. Where you mentioned earlier the case of the Afghan guard that was formerly an Afghan guard that is now
Mm-hmm.
plotting or was planning to planning a plot against the U.S. That is it's like how it's a situation that is very tough, especially with obviously elections now coming in. Like people are paying attention to. It's like you've got this big picture, but there's a smaller picture that has a probably an equal impact on what could happen domestically here in the U.S. And that must be really frustrating, especially since you, Sarah, have been carrying out so much an investigation and obviously trying to uh, bring about a great deal of attention to these issues that are happening here domestically. I mean, that must be really tough to, to see this level of minimal attention being paid to this situation.
Well, yeah, I mean, we talked about how like Afghans came here and became radicalized, but the other real thing that kind of broke America a little bit when the fall of Kabul happened, it impacted 20 years of veterans, right? The suicide rate skyrocketed. Like we haven't seen the numbers yet, but it's sad. Like in all the circles I'm involved in, there are lots of suicides, lots of bankruptcies, lots of divorces, and lots of foreclosures because people invested their money into saving Afghans just from that small period. Okay. So I know we call it moral injury, but there's so much more that happened beyond that. So I saw that happen in 2021. Now, these groups are plotting again, right? Al Qaeda is plotting a homeland attack again. Now, what like if you think of how 9/11 affected America at the time, a lot of people had no concept of Al Qaeda, Bin Laden, terrorism. They knew some terrorist attacks, obviously. Like the Africa bombings, the coal. Like they understood those, but they weren't impacted by them. Now you had a whole generation volunteer to go overseas and fight them. So if and when Al Qaeda pulls off, it's what they're planning to be their 2025 attackers are calling it. Can you imagine the impact that's going to have on all the men and women who spent all those years overseas going after these guys? It's going to break an entire generation in this country. Like, I don't think people are even thinking about like what that is going to do. Like, and I know people say, hey, the focus is China and Russia, and they are long term, but we have a major short term issue that's going to cause way more damage in the near term, and we can't say, oh well, that doesn't matter anymore because you can't wait till after the fact to deal with this.
Right. But it seems like this is what's happening, where they're waiting until something happens and then there's a reaction. There's no sort of preemptive measure to try to tackle the root of the problem and try to fix the issue before it expands and becomes too big to control. And that's very, very tough, especially with the community that you're part of and the broader community of the veterans who have served abroad. It's like all of this effort is sort of going to waste now. I mean, it's like, hey, U.S. government, we got to do something. So that's really rough. It's really rough.
It
Um,
is. And we had the same problem in Benghazi. So after Gaddafi fell, a lot of terrorists came into the country, right? So you'd think the focus would have been on collection against the terrorism, but it wasn't. The focus was on political reporting, right? I always say we only had one or two counterterrorism case officers in the entire country, right? That's prioritization by our politicians saying this is what we're giving you money for and this is what you collect on, right? So we were sitting ducks in Benghazi, like there wasn't counterterrorism dollars, let's say, going to the NSA, right, to do signal collection on terrorists in Benghazi. Like none of that existed. So it's almost like they put us there, and we were only ever going to be attacked, right? And we didn't have any of the collection to protect ourselves, right? And
mm,
now we're seeing this on a giant scale. In Afghanistan, we lost 98 to 99% of collection, according to the head of CENTCOM, right? Like that's a very high number for him to say. And so to have that kind of black hole, and look at the black hole just for the Israel attacks, right? Look at that,
yeah.
killed over 1,000 people. So yeah, like this lack of focus is like you're watching this train come, right? And you know it's gonna like smash into a car and you just have to watch it. It's like the most frustrating thing ever.
Gosh, Uh, the- I remember there was a time when I was attending this lecture with my professor, and we brought in two individuals from the agency. I forgot what their names were, but I'll reach out to my professor and maybe share those names with you because you might recognize them. um, at the time we were, just sort of having a discussion with them about obviously their careers and some of some of the key operations that they can talk about and the impact that they've and the impact of those operations. But in any case, um, I do remember, I think, one of the students asking a question about how they deal with the sort of the work, how they deal with policymakers not perhaps prioritizing some of the reports that they submit or some of the the key elements of an impending danger where the agent knows that this is important, but the policymaker, even though they are being, briefed about it, they're not doing anything, or they're doing small things to tackle the problem, but they're paying attention to other things. And that, I think, especially with these people that were brought to the lecture, they said it is frustrating, but at the same time, you are serving. You're not going to be political about this. You are serving the country. You're serving your government. No matter what happens, you're going to do your job. And maybe that's something that resonates with you. And maybe I might even have a story about that where, you find yourself in a position where you are providing accurate information about something that's very important that should be paid at being, that the policymakers should pay attention to, but they're not. And that, I'm sure that's really disappointing as well.
Yeah, I mean that happens as you can imagine a lot of times. One of the biggest problems, right? A lot of the analysts working ISIS, for example, President Obama didn't really want to hear about them, right? And so they would, like you said, keep putting the reports forward, keep putting the reports forward, and they weren't listened to your action and worked on. And unfortunately, your job is to answer the questions of the policymakers and to give them information so they can make decisions, you know? I mean, one of the things I really like to focus on is if you do think it's to a level, right, that goes beyond, you can do more. So, I had a situation where we were getting a lot of pressure from policymakers to do drone activities, right? And there was the Mumbai attacks, and we were getting pressure from policymakers to actually do drone strikes, right? And this was in my book
Right.
on the terrorists involved. But as you know, and if anyone in the region there knew, where we were doing the drone strikes, right, weren't where the Kashmiri militant camps were, right? Two different sides of Pakistan. So we really couldn't affect them in that way. But I did have a boss that was going to do a strike on a camp that had bad reporting that it belonged to the group, even though we debunked it, just to make them happy, right? And there is a lot of that because of the politicalization. And so, of course, I ended up stopping that and caused, obviously some problems in my career doing it. But there are times you can't just say, this is my job, I march in line, right? Because you're also hired for your ethics, right? Like you're not just hired because you have this skill or that skill. You're hired because you're going to do the right thing to protect America and by American ideals and for the American people, right? And so that luckily does exist, and a lot of people do step up, right, and say, hey, it shouldn't have been done this way. I think you're seeing a lot after the fact of a lot of people in the government who really didn't believe in the Iraq war, and not enough of them said it at the time, right? And now after the fact, pretty much everyone in my generation, and I'm one of them, right? Like none of us believed in the Iraq war, and none of us thought we should go to war in Iraq, right? It's
Yeah.
like you almost have to have that groundswell early, right? And we have to get that back into the government. Like that doesn't really exist in the military. There's a chain of command. It's very difficult to do that. We saw with Stu Scheller after Afghanistan. That's not how they are. But the intelligence community is very different. In CIA, it's truth to power, right? I can
Mhm.
tell the director of the CIA he's wrong, right? I'm not going to get in trouble for that. I'm not going to supposed to get reprimanded from that, right? Like they hire you because you're one of the people who can do that, and we have to keep having people like that.
Right. Right. I remember a story from one of my former guests here on the show, and I'm sure you recognize him. His name is Rick Prado, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, he was he's also in the
One
agency
knows
for.
him. He's famous.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, 24 years in the agency and a lot of interesting stories that you know Rick has, and so we were having a conversation on the show. I don't know, a month ago or something. And one of the things that he brought to the discussion was the hunt for Osama bin Laden. And I remember he mentioned that in the 1990s, he and another operative were in not Afghanistan, in Sudan actually,
Mm-hmm.
and they had eyes on bin Laden, but at the time, there were no I guess, orders by the U.S. government to have him apprehended or perhaps even killed.
Mm-hmm.
And then he felt a level of perhaps regret after the fact when the 9/11 happened, and obviously with the ensuing hunt of bin Laden, because at early on they had eyes on him, and he could have they could have gotten him, but because you didn't have orders from above, you couldn't act on that, and that instilled perhaps a sense of guilt on Rick, and he was recalling that story, and obviously at the outset, it's like, man, we might have been able to prevent those attacks from happening if we had those orders to apprehend or perhaps even, kill bin Laden at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I had two situations like that. One of my targets, we had the approvals on him for a year and they
Mm.
went away. And unfortunately, he ended up killing in attack, of course. He didn't target him himself, but he ended up killing a friend of mine,
Oof.
in a suicide bombing. We ended up killing him eventually accidentally. He was at a location and we were striking and he was there. And then another great example is Muqtab al-Muqtar. Remember, I went up to Libya to capture him. Well, our chief wanted me to capture him. The headquarters didn't approve me to capture him. We ended up pushing through all the approvals, but it took so long to get the approvals. Ended up kind of having a 1 day window to get him. And then, as you know, he ended up being the mastermind, and right, he basically his attack led to the death of ambassador, right?
Right.
So so many people in the CIA also had those type of situations, right? Where it's like, if one thing had gone better sooner, could it have been different, right? It's a frustrating career, right? Because you see your failures just as equally as your successes, right? And you do have to live with them, and you usually don't get to talk about them with anyone. I luckily got a few of my stories approved, as you know, from my book, but there are so many things like that that will always weigh on you, right? Because you take it as a personal account, even though, as you know, everything can go wrong in some of these countries, right? Like, you could try forever to get someone and never get him, right? It's a frustrating thing, and it's a frustrating career for some people.
Gosh, no, I would imagine. I mean, you mentioned the story of Mukhtar, and obviously the loss of your friend. That's a major deal. I mean, in those situations, what's the mindset like? Maybe you can recall some of those memories. I mean, what was going on in your mind, and especially when you experience such a loss. I mean, it's like, is that is that I mean, obviously it is sad and perhaps even reckoning, but there's that might create also a sense of motivation of wanting to maybe overcompensate and go after it. I'd be interested to know more about that sort of what's the psychology of that and what was going on in your mind at the time.
Yeah, a couple different things can happen. Like you said, some people go all in, right, and be like, I'm going back to the war zone and I'm going to take it to these guys. And then they're not in the right mental space. Another thing that happens, though, and people don't realize this, is a lot of people quit. And
Mm,
you've invested large, I mean, just recruiting into the CIA is a lot of money to pick the talent, right? And then you put them through these long training programs, and then they serve overseas in these environments and they pick up all these skills. And then this trigger happens, and they're like, I'm out, and they leave, and you lose so much skill and so much talent, right? And I think that's one of the things that gets lost in it. And then you have the strange thing, like people like me, right, who are like, well, maybe I can do a better job outside of this environment, right? Maybe I can find different ways to get after it, because some of us did feel harmed by our government, right? We thought, hey, our friends died. Why did you not prioritize going after their attackers, right? And it's not just us that feels that way. There's a lot of people who their family member gets kidnapped, right?
mm,
Like James Foley type of thing. And then they die, right, by the terrorist hands in custody. And those families kind of feel like, could you have done more? Should you have done more? And they sometimes feel like, hey, the government let me down. And so we do have that feeling too of people in my generation just thinking, my government let me down, which is strange because I volunteered to serve them. Like, why aren't they giving back what I gave?
right, right. That would be rather emotionally debilitating. There's there's also, I guess, the idea of wanting to maybe, like you mentioned, maybe you can create a sort of change from the outside. Um, and I think you are creating that level of, trying to make a change, trying to maybe bring more attention into what's unfolding domestically and abroad, especially in Afghanistan. But at the same time, I think this is a question and maybe you don't get a lot. What what do you maybe miss most about being in the agency now that you've been out for a while?
I mean, the thing I miss most about the agency is the budgets and the technology, right? Because if you need to get something done, you have the money to do it. You don't have to like count pennies or beg for money.
Mm,
Now, right? I'll have an amazing lead or amazing opportunity, but I can't personally fund it, right? And so I
mm.
have to like not do it, right? And it kills you, right? Because you're like, if I was in the CIA, I could have ran down all these rabbit holes and I would have the answer by now, right? So I
Right.
find that as like a frustrating thing, because you did have when I, at least what I did in the CIA, I always was in a position where I was kind of got to be a self starter. I got to work kind of like my own targets and my own projects, right? So I had a lot of ownership.
Mm,
And then, like I said, I had a lot of resources to to play that out. And so it is hard when you don't have those resources anymore.
right. No, I would imagine that it's like a blessing in disguise, and once it's you no longer have it, it's like, oh, I miss that, you know.
Oh, like running a phone number? Like, oh, I get phone numbers all the time and I can't do anything with it. It like I like lose sleep over it. I'm like, oh
Oh
my gosh,
gosh.
someone could be using this phone number right now. So yeah, it's a frustrating thing.
Oh my Lord. And what here's another question that maybe you don't get asked a lot as well. But um if you were to look back at your days at the agency, what if what is a case or a scenario, if you can disclose it, that you think you could have done better? Something that you're like, maybe I could have done a better job at that one.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting thing to bring up, right? One of my biggest failures, it wasn't a failure, but I went overseas and there was a piece of training I didn't have, but I
Oh,
didn't know I was going to need it. And that training was basically to do the training to talk to a detainee. Okay. So
uh-huh.
I go overseas, no plans to talk to detainees. And I go to this location, and the boss there was like, oh, I'm going to teach you everything about my job. And I was like, okay. So every day he put me through like the craziest things. And so then one day he's like, we're going to go debrief a guy from Al-Quaeda today. And I was like, okay, right? No background. Well, so I do all my reading on him. I knew who he was. So it's not like I was going in and knew nothing, but I did my reading. I looked at his photo and I went in and they bring him in the room and he has this black bag on his head, which I know is in the movies. But if you've had no training with this, like it almost made me panic a bit. I was like, they have this black bag, and I know he's a terrorist, right? But you're still a human. I was like, they got this black bag on him. Oh my gosh. So they take it off and he's super skinny. But in the photo I saw, he's super fat. And I was like, oh my God. So in my head, I'm like, what is the Pakistanis doing to this poor guy? At night, are they torturing him? So the funny part is, right, because you have all these emotions. I had no training to deal with it, and I know he was a terrorist in front of me, right, but I had no interactions with him. So I'm just seeing this human come in, and I'm having all these physical emotions to what I expected it to be, right? So that when it was funny, after that trip, I went back and told my boss, like, I'm going to this training the next time it opens. And it actually mattered so much to me. I went on to be a trainer in that program because I didn't want anyone else to feel that way. Because I'm really a super even keel person. And it
Oh,
was one of the first times I kind of felt, I guess, what would be anxiety for most people, right? And
right.
I was just, my brain was all over the place, and I was like making up scenarios in my head. I had this guy hanging by his feet at night in the Pakistani jail, like in my head, right? They
Oh
weren't
my
doing
God.
it, but yeah, so that's probably one thing that I could have gone into a little better.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, I don't think it was, maybe it wasn't after all your mistake, You didn't think he needed it. He made an
And they
assumption.
should have taken a better picture of him. Like it was just a bad angle. It was not accurate to what he looked like.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's a lesson for also. uh, Wow. There's another question I wanted to ask you about I noticed it recently. There's what's the story of like super bad? Like that's is that your code name? Is that because I see it and I'm like there has to be a story about that.
Well, the thing is, we all have call signs, right, when we're overseas. And like, usually someone chooses them for you, but I had a lame one. It was just one from like the area I was from, in the United States, but it wasn't anything good. And so I had a reputation for like maybe going around the rules, doing things ethically, but like getting stuff done. And so Boone, who ended up being my co-author many years later, would call me
Mhm.
super bad. He's like, oh, well, super bad, I'll get away with it, or super bad, I'll figure out how to do it. And so it became my nickname. And then you'll see some people shorten it. So like Tonto from Benghazi calls me SB, and people are always like, "What's that about?" I'm like, "Well, it's just super bad shortened." So yeah, it's just everyone gets their call signs, and mine's good, right? People have bad call
Yeah.
signs. I remember when I was overseas, there's this guy, his call sign was somebody. And so like we had to do all this radio chat and it would be like, hey, whatever, Princess is here with somebody. And then the boss, it's like he never could catch on. He's like, who's somebody? He'd say it like 50 times. So finally we had to change the guy's name because the boss could like never like dawned on him. It's like they've said somebody 40 times. Like, but
Oh
yeah,
my
so some call signs don't work, but it is what it is.
That just reminds me of a hilarious scene from a movie called Rush Hour 3. And I don't know if you know that scene or you've seen that movie, but they're in this place where they're talking to, I guess, Chinese people, and it's just a comedic scene, but essentially the names are you and me or something like that. So that creates a great deal of confusion. And that's just,
Yeah, it's like who's on second or all that stuff, right?
right. Yeah. And I'm sure a lot of people that might be listening to this would probably know what that scene is. But yeah, I do have one final question, and and this is actually about Boone and the tag name or the code. So we talked about your code and your co-author Boone, Benghazi, Know Thy Enemy. What's the code about? Or do we need Boone to sort of explain it?
Oh, like Boone's call sign?
Yeah, that's
Oh, well, that comes from his military time. So most of the guys, they had a call sign when they were in the military, and he used to be a Marine. And then they carried those same call signs over to the CIA. So usually the call sign has nothing to do with their time in the CIA unless they did something super stupid and got a
mm,
new one. So yeah, so those are mostly just like lame military stories, and nobody wants to hear those. They're always boring.
right. I'm sure for some for some it's hilarious. Oh gosh. Well,
Yeah.
Tara, I really appreciate your time, and I'm glad we got to do this. And it's the what's happening right now in the Middle East is quite dynamic. A lot of things changing. I never expected that I would, before I record this episode with you, that news of Sinwar dying breaking out. So that really that's a major piece of news that I'm sure in the next couple of days or even coming weeks, a lot of other stuff will be unfolding, and we'll probably be keeping an eye out on that. So again, I mean, thank you for showing up and having this conversation with me. I really appreciate that.
No, thank you. I mean, obviously, besides having the living connection, you also have, a lot of background on Lebanon too, right? So it's good to talk to someone too who's very abreast of the situation going on.